Well, hello, Wichita Art Museum fans in virtual land, and welcome to a virtual talk by independent curator and writer Candice Hopkins. She's there on the screen with me. She joins us from Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm Patricia McDonald, director of the Wichita Art Museum, and I am here in the S. Jim and Darla Farha Great Hall in Wichita. So just a little bit of virtual etiquette. Please mute your computers or what you're coming in through, and also put stop video so that we don't end up with you on our screen. At any rate, we invited Kansas to talk this evening in conjunction with our current exhibition on Preston Singletary, his Raven and the Box of Daylight. Well, there's really good news about that exhibition. We were able to extend the run of the show through the winter holidays, and in fact through January 17th next year. So we'll be here for a nice long while. And I want to acknowledge and thank our partners at the Mid-America All Indian Center. They're right across the street in Wichita. They've been wonderful friends and great collaborators on the Singletary programs. Very compelling show on a Tlingit artist, Seattle-based. People have just been raving about the show as they experience it. And as we were working on the exhibition and bringing it here and developing it, we were eager to have a larger context for understanding this particular amazing work and having a context for American Indian art today. And therefore we connected with Candice. But before introducing our speaker, very important to acknowledge really a list of wonderful people who helped the Wichita Art Museum bring the show here for our audiences. So bear with me, this is quite a list. Wonderful people have stepped forward. So our presenting sponsor is the F. Price Kosman Memorial Trust at Intrust Bank. Lead patrons are the DeVore Foundation and Mrs. Judy Slauson. Fred and Mary Koch Foundation provided additional major underwriting. Charles Baker, our great friend, was a principal sponsor. Emprise Bank is a substantial corporate sponsor. Generous additional support above and beyond was provided by Louise Barron, the Berry Foundation, Donna Bunk, Mary Eves, Norma Griever, Dr. Dennis and Mrs. Ann Ross, Mary Sue Smith, Sarah T. Smith, the K.T. Wiedemann Foundation, Janice and Jeff Van Sickle, and Sue and Kurt Watson. But there are more. Additional patrons include Dr. John and Nancy Bramer, Sharon and Dr. Alan Feary, Tony and Bud Gates, Carol and Guy Glidden. As a matter of fact, I know they're streaming in as we speak. Patty Gorham and Jeff Kennedy, Sonia Gredeman and Chris Brunner, Trish Higgins, Mary and Delmar Clucky, Mary Lynn and Bill Oliver, and Will and Kristen Price. And all of the exhibitions at our museum are sponsored by the Friends of the Wichita Art Museum in the city of Wichita. So quite an impressive and extensive list. So Kansas is a savvy, networked, I would say ultra busy curator, thinker, and writer. She was born in Whitehorse, Yukon in Canada, and she is a citizen of the Carcross and Tagish First Nation. She's worked in Canada and the United States and also internationally. She was the director curator at Western Front in Vancouver, Canada for 4 years. She was the managing curator for the 2016 exhibition at SITE Santa Fe. She's been the senior curator for the Toronto Biennial in 2019 and then upcoming in 2021. And I am here to tell you that her list of exhibitions, publications, lectures, classes taught at university goes on for pages and pages, and I could dazzle you with many of those accomplishments and projects. But to get to Kansas in our region, she came to our attention in particular as a co-curator for an exhibition with the title Art for a New Understanding, Native Art Now, 1950s to Now, which was developed at the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas. It's a show that was there in 2018. And with her co-curator, she wrote, "This survey is only a beginning. The artists featured in the show have made significant impacts. These artists have not only changed the ways in which you think about contemporary Indigenous art, but also contributed greatly to contemporary art more broadly." Knowing that, we were eager to learn from her, so we invited her to come speak to all of you who are dialing in through virtual land and hear her perspective, her smarts. So Kansas, and looking at you, thank you for joining us across miles in the ether, the virtue of the internet. So I'm now sending camera focus and limelight to you. Thank you, Candice.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. It's so nice to see all the names of folks here in the audience, in the virtual world. It's a very different world than even when I was first invited to speak at the Wichita Art Museum. And I want to give my thanks to Tara, to Sherry, to Terry, and of course, Patricia for inviting me. And I must say it's pretty rare to have such an emphasis on not only Tlingit art from the Northwest Coast. I also happen to be Tlingit from the Yukon. We are the Gunnocksteady clan through my mother's side. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Tiwa land in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is also on the edges of Navajo land and has been a meeting point of many people and continues to be a meeting point of many people now and many Indigenous folks. So just acknowledging that, the land that I'm addressing you from. And what I want to do is I'm going to tell you a bit of a story. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to share a number of images with you and tell you a bit more about how Art for a New Understanding came to be. And I think that in a way, our intention with the exhibition was to trace a history, one history of multiple and many, it can be told many, many different ways, of the development of contemporary Native art in the United States and also in tandem with many similar movements happening in Canada. So I'm going to share my screen now and share with you what we did as part of that exhibition. So I hope there's some knowledge gained from it. And again, I'm just really gracious for this opportunity. So I think I just need to be enabled to share my screen and then I'll be able to show you all of these images. One thing that I would say just while we're getting that set up for me to be a co-host to do that is that one of the reasons that we organized this exhibition, Art for a New Understanding, was because we felt like there was a massive gap within the understanding of American art, because oftentimes Native art gets segregated. It's often in its own galleries. It's not necessarily integrated with the main collections. And we wanted to do something different. We felt like there is a missing piece of the puzzle of American art. And it is also unique to the development of artistic discourse here in the United States. As many of you know, I think that's why you've joined this conversation today as well. We also felt like it was really important for us to begin with, actually, even though the subtitle of the exhibition is Native Voices 1950s till now, some of the earliest works we had on view were from the 1940s. So that shows you the trajectory of this development. And another reason that we wanted to do this is because we recognized that there are a lot of surveys of Native art, of contemporary Native art, but many of them are either monographic, so that is focusing on a single artist, or they only go back about a decade. And we wanted to begin building an art history for this movement. So I'll share my screen now with you, and you can see what I want to share. So in this first image, you see the entrance when the exhibition was installed at Crystal Bridges Museum, which I hope many of you have visited, which is in Bentonville, Arkansas. And it was always intended as a touring exhibition. So every time it was shown, it has changed. So one, as I said, we recognize that art by Native people in the United States has largely been left out of the history of modern and contemporary art, when in our view, it's in fact fundamental to why we have particular kinds of modern and contemporary art in the United States. So it either has existed on the periphery, so thereby represented by a few key figures or a few key collections, or through what has been considered a parallel set of exhibition histories, a parallel set of critics, of curators, of art historians, and writers. And in fact, they've rarely intersected. So what we wanted to show with this exhibition, one that was initiated, I must say, many years before I came on board, and that was by Manuela Wellhoffman, who's now at the Institute of American Indian Art Museum of Contemporary Native Arts. And we were later joined by curator of American art, Mindy Besaw at Crystal Bridges. So with this in mind, instead of another survey, as I said, of which there have been many, we wanted to trace a longer trajectory. So beginning with artists from the 1950s, who at that time, and this is something that we already knew, but we wanted to underline, they were defining themselves as both modern and cosmopolitan, and they saw their work being in dialogue with other artists who were working at the time. And in fact, there were many collaborations and many intersections. And for some reason, a lot of those collaborations have been lost or forgotten. So we feel like in order for museums of American art, like Crystal Bridges, they consider themselves a museum of American art, to more fully represent American art history, there needs to be critical strides made in supporting the work of Native artists. We thought that it was necessary not to begin not 10 or even 20 years ago, but in the 1950s, because in that decade, many Native American, Alaska Native artists, First Nations artists, Métis and Inuit artists in Canada were having these long-standing exchanges and starting to build shared exhibition histories, as well as at that time, and you'll see this in a moment, really challenging what perceptions are, or even preconceptions of what constitutes the term at that time being used, Indian art. So they actively positioned their work within the canon discourses of modernism. Many of them had formal art school degrees behind them. But this didn't mean that what they did was always seen as being included. So this is the cover of Art in America that came out a bit by surprise, in fact, after the exhibition. And the critic, an art historian named Christopher Green, what he was making the case for is that exhibitions like this can move beyond the idea of inclusion. So collections that are simply including more Native art or more Native voices, and actually trying to create what we might consider a kind of structural change in how we understand the history of American art. So those are different things. And what was placed on the cover is a weaving by Dene, or Navajo weaver, Melissa Cody. And what she sees as part of her practice is always a commitment to innovation. And you see this with works that might be considered to be in traditional media, like weaving. You always see that actually innovation is one of the primary markers, I think, of what a lot of great Native artists always want to contribute and speak to. So one of the things that we recognized with the show was that this survey is only a beginning. But what we wanted to do was to kind of talk about these figures who made ground shifts within our understanding of Native art, and that continues now. So one of the points that Christopher brought out, and also we wanted to speak about, was this idea that Indigenous art might not easily rest in the category of what we consider to be American art. One of the reasons is because, as we know, Indigenous peoples were here and you know, forming democracies and societies, and even you know, things like very complex math systems and calendars and timekeeping and all of these technologies that existed, you know, before the arrival of European settlers. So what does that mean? What does it mean for Indigenous art to be part of the canon of American art? Does it mean even that terminology or that understanding needs to shift? So one of the first pieces that you saw when you entered this exhibition is this work, and it's a painting by Oscar Howe. And it's a painting that dates from the 1950s. And he, from the beginning, was committed to the language of abstraction, in part because he felt like through abstraction, he could actually better represent, in this case, what you see as a dance. So he can better represent the energy of that, the shape of that, the feeling of that. But when he started painting in this style, one of the biggest, you could say, platforms for Native artists working in the region was to exhibit your work as part of the Philbrook Annual. So in 1958, he caused something of a stir when he started critiquing that form. This letter that he wrote in 1958 is considered one of the first, you could say, manifestos of Indigenous autonomy in art, or a declaration of sovereignty, a kind of aesthetic sovereignty. So he wrote in the letter, he says, "Are we to be held back forever with one phase of Indian painting that is the most common way?" And of course, he's speaking back here to the kind of flat, two-dimensional style that was really fostered by Dorothy Dunn in the Santa Fe Indian School. But then I would say also that kind of aesthetic was very prevalent as well through Oklahoma and other regions. He says, "Are we to be herded like a bunch of sheep with no right for individualism, dedicated to, as the Indian has always been, put on reservations, treated like a child, and only the white man will know what is best for him? One could easily turn to become a social protest painter." So this is 1958 when he's talking about this. "I only hope the art world will not be one more contributor to holding us in chains." So he didn't hold back. So not only was he railing, I think, against a very limited perception of Native art, that there's only, you know, one style, it has to look a certain way, that abstraction or the kind of infusion of modernist aesthetics and discourses was somehow tainting what was considered a very particular aesthetic of Native art. So he was calling attention to the fact that this is a kind of bias, but he was also calling attention to the paternalistic reservation system, for example, and Native administered boarding schools. And what, in my mind, he was really calling attention to too was art should be for artists a space of freedom. So they define how it's represented and the aesthetic forms that they want to engage with. So you can see that here's an example of how the show looked at Crystal Bridges. And 1 year after his letter, so that this takes us to 1959, as a way to support the development and discourse on Native art, the Rockefeller Foundation organized a conference called New Directions in Indian Art. And that took place at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And there were a number of important figures who took part in that, including Lloyd Kivanu, including Fritz Scholder, and including then director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Renee de Harnecourt. So there were a few things that came out of this conference, and we wanted to point to it because it does shape the work that you see even in this image. So that was one, the University of Arizona's Southwest Indian Art Projects, and that ran for 3 years. And that offered programs actually directed towards Native youth so that they could engage with contemporary art forms and practices. And then also coming out of that was the Institute of American Indian Arts, which was established in 1962 out of actually an act of Congress. So that's very unique for an institute of higher education to come out of that kind of act. So what it wanted to foster was creativity, leadership, and self-determination. That was its mission and mandate from the beginning. And it would actually recruit Lloyd Kivanu, Fritz Scholder as a instructor, and then they would teach students like T.C. Canon. So you see this kind of relationship happening even in this first room at Crystal Bridges. So you have Oscar Howe kind of form this rupture, and then you have in the foreground Textiles by Lloyd Kivanu that date from the 40s all the way to the 60s, and in the background a painting by T.C. Canon. One of the things that they wanted to do right from the beginning was to develop a curriculum that was based on experimentation in material, in form, and technique. So you had, even when you go into the archives of IAIA, you have ceramics that were made by students who were coming from the Northwest Coast. So you have forms that would normally traditionally be found in wood, and now all of a sudden they're in ceramic. You also have all of these students coming and taking their particular aesthetics and transforming them into these textiles. So these textiles that you see in the foreground were always intended, in fact, by Lloyd Kivanu, who was a fashion designer. He moved from Scottsdale to work at IAIA. They were intended for mass production. So he really saw the way that Indigenous aesthetics could shape not only kind of contemporary art, which you could consider to be a very particular audience, but in fact to shape the aesthetics of more broadly, and particular through design. So one of the things that they did at the beginning was they actually commissioned the Italian visionary architect Paolo Soleri to design their amphitheater, which was for the practice of new native theater. And then they gained support, which was then, I would say, a very liberal climate, and also the social and political activism of the 1960s and 1970s. And you can understand here that was going on at this time was the formation of the American Indian movement out of other groups in the late 1960s. There was the confrontation, of course, at Wounded Knee. There was also at the same time the authorization of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. And parallel to this, so coming out of and leading up to the development of the American Indian movement, is the rapid growth of the Red Power movement, which was taking place in concert with civil rights more broadly. So this was an opportunity, I think, for some of these concerns to come out in the mainstream, but at the same time, artists continued to innovate. So this is a textile piece, and it's one of my favorites that Lloyd Kivanu did, and it's based on the Cherokee Syllabary. To me, it looks like a very early example of conceptual text-based art. One of the things that I think is important to understand about the Cherokee Syllabary is it was developed also in tandem with the understanding of the potential of the printing press. So newspapers, for example, as a way of communicating more broadly, not only amongst Cherokee people, but also understanding that literacy broadly would be a tool for self-determination. So even though this might look like a piece of design, I actually see it as quite a profound statement on that movement of early self-determination. Here's, I think, pretty great images of Lloyd Kivanu in collaboration with other textile artists at his studio in Scottsdale, Arizona in 1957, before he shifted a lot of that work to the Institute of American Indian Arts, where he would collaborate with students more broadly. So you can see the scale of the production of what they were doing at the time. We also have here earlier works as well from the 1950s by George Morrison. So you have these artists who maybe weren't in direct dialogue, but they're starting to really engage with some of the tenets of modernism and modern art. To me, these really speak to George Morrison's interest in surrealism. He considered himself to be a surrealist artist, in fact, and was in dialogue with that kind of those artists and that practice. Yet a little later, but not much later, in Canada, in a very small island called Wikwemikwan, you have someone like Daphne Ojig, who is also starting to paint in a very particular kind of self-realized style. So this is a work called Nana Bajou and His Daughter from 1969. And Daphne began painting in this way in the early 1960s because her sister, whose name was Rosemary Peltier, had thought that maybe one way of kind of relearning or ensuring that their stories would remain part of their culture, she asked Daphne if Daphne would be interested in illustrating children's books. So that's how she started her what are called legend series, was as a way of, dispersing these stories through her community, but at the same time, she forged what was considered to be a new painting style in Canada, along with Norvel Moroso, and that's called the Woodland School of Art. So what they were taking were these older, you could say, design forms and aesthetics and philosophies from birch bark painting, from petroglyphs, the form lines from those, and transforming them into these new paintings. And this is from a series called Tales from the Smokehouse, where she illustrated a kind of rather racy novel that was transcribed, I wouldn't say authored, but transcribed by a person who was working as a doctor, a non-native doctor, working in the community, named Herbert Schwartz. This is Norvel Moroso. So he was making very similar style painting. At first, they didn't know about one another, but this is a photograph of him and standing in front of one of his paintings from 1977. What was important, I think, about what Norvel Moroso was doing, of course, people tried to make him into a singular figure, but one of the things that we wanted to do with this exhibition was showing that there were other artists working in this style, is his emergence and his solo show at a place called Pollock Gallery in Toronto in the 1960s, which sold out on the night of its opening, really created the understanding that I would say in Canada that Native art was modern. They called him immediately the Picasso of the North in newspapers, and they saw really what he was doing as being incredibly unique. But in a way, he was doing what artists have always done. He was transcribing the narrative, the aesthetics, and the stories of his people. So that's what you see here. So these kinds of dialogues continued. This is an early work that T.C. Canon did as a student, instructor in green, and in fact, the person that he's painting is Fritz Scholder, and it's Scholder in front of one of his blanket paintings that he was making at the time, these kind of striped works that look like landscapes to me. But you can see that he's very decidedly, cosmopolitan with his glasses and these amazing shoes. And I think that one of the things that this painting did for us was just show this dialogue that was happening between artists. So these aren't singular figures. These are artists who are working together to create a new movement in Native art. This is a painting by Scholder at the same time, Monster Indian. And again, I think this was the beginning of an opportunity for artists to begin to speak back to stereotypical or conventional representations of Native people. T.C. Canon, despite the fact that he passed away as such a young artist in his 30s, was incredibly mature as an image maker. This is a piece, collector number 5. He did a number of these, and you can see what's happening here, right? There's this very particular kind of reversal. So you have the person who is normally the subject and had been the subject for a very long time. If you think of even photographs by Edward Curtis, for example, and others. So here you have a painting by T.C. Canon, and he's switched the idea of who's being collected and who is the collector. So on his wall is what you can, what looks like a painting by Van Gogh. So he's collecting kind of the high art, Europe's high art. He has the ability to do so. He looks out of the picture plane at you with an incredible degree of agency. So in this single painting, I think T.C. Canon was really trying to not only call attention to hierarchies within the narrative of modern art in general, but also, you know, with the humor sort of, I would say subvert them as well. And then you can also notice that the wallpaper behind him is also from modern art as well, and it's Fauvist wallpaper. So he has multiple dialogues happening at the same time. And the fact that his sitter is wearing very traditional regalia is, I would say, another front to the kind of misconception that was always trying to place Native people in a kind of timeless past, but not in the present. I would also say that paintings like this, like the one by T.C. Canon, started to be enacted very differently in the 1980s. This is one of, I would say, the most important instances of what I consider to be culturally specific institutional critique. This is the late Luiseño artist James Luna performing artifact piece in 1987 at the San Diego Museum of Man. And anyone who's ever been to this museum, it feels like even now a bit of a museum that's stuck in time. And what he, of course, was saying is that this is where you see us. You see us mainly in vitrines. You never see necessarily our contemporary life represented. So he wanted to place himself in the vitrine. The vitrine was custom made exactly to his size. You can see his, you know, it goes right from head to feet. One of the things that he told me about this performance was, one, it was a piece of performance art. He had to teach and train himself to breathe so minimally and take such long inhales and exhales that it wouldn't be possible to see any movement in his chest or his stomach. It was a durational experience or performance. He did it for hours at a time. And he also shared with me that people weren't surprised to see a Native body in a vitrine in a museum. They were only shocked when they discovered that he was alive. So for me, this is incredibly profound, that it showed the kind of degree of comfort, like an acceptability, thinking, okay, you know, this is where we're, you know, comfortable with seeing the things of Native culture and even Native people. But he did another number of subversions as well. So you see that there's these little plaques beside his body, and where you think that they would be a kind of typical explanatory information that's usually in the voice of the institution, instead it would say things like, you know, I got this scar after leaving this bar because I fell and this happened and this happened. And so they were all highly subjective and very personal. So again, trying to switch that authorial voice of the institution, which is never subjective and is often never authored by any particular person. And it's always, you would say, a kind of voice of the expert. So one of the things that we did too is we dug a little deeper into this performance. We exhibited a drawing or a sketch that he made prior to it that had never been seen. We also felt like it was really important to show him being viewed by others. So not just the way that this performance is often included in books and where you only see him in the vitrine, but in fact how others interacted with him. So here's another close-up of him being looked at. And something that's often left out about this performance is that there was another vitrine as well. So it wasn't just his body, but he also included, you can see it here, he's labeled it personal documents. So you see all of these pictures from his childhood and his family, but then you also see all of these things that, you know, were influencing him at that moment in time. You have a LP from the Sex Pistols, Never Mind the Bullocks, and you see all of these things that, you know, become part of him from not only popular culture and music, but also very personal effects as well. 1 year later, and they didn't know each other at the time, they became very close friends later on. Rebecca Belmore also put herself in a vitrine. Rebecca, this is a performance protest that took place in what is called Gatineau, Quebec. At the time it was called Oka, Hull. And what they were calling attention to was a traveling exhibition called The Spirit Sings, Artistic Traditions of Canada's First Peoples. And it originated at the Glenbow Museum. And right from the beginning, Native artists in Calgary, Alberta, were calling out the deep complicity with the institution, for one, their main sponsor being Shell Oil Canada, and number two, the lack of consultation or even representation of contemporary Native art or even, you know, Native people, period. And when this exhibition traveled to the Canadian Museum, what is now called the Canadian Museum of History, which was then the Canadian Museum of Civilization, they also included a number of works. We call them now cultural belongings instead of artifact. Artifact implies something that doesn't have any agency and is in the past. And also to point to the fact that these have communities, they have homes, they have owners that often are not the museum rightfully. And they included things like false face masks that should never be seen by the uninitiated. And had they worked with even Native advisors, they would have known that. So out of this also formed a very important rupture within Canada. They authored, there was a commissioning of a document led by Native people called the Task Force on Museums and First Peoples in Canada. And out of that were a number of recommendations that formed a kind of protocol for practices with regards to any time Native work was represented, whether it was current work being made or cultural belongings. So it was another rupture point. So in 1989, same year, the artist Carl Beam, who's also from Wakankan, this island that Daphne Ojig is from, travels down to the Dominican Republic. He does it for a very particular reason. He wants to do this performance in this video called Burying the Ruler. Of course, we can understand the ruler not just as the kind of measuring stick, kind of colonial device from him, but of course, ruler as in colonial ruler in general. But the reason he went to the Dominican is he wanted to go to the site of the landing of Columbus's ships and the running aground of the Santa Maria. He wanted to really go to the origin of, you know, what would then unfold all of these events that have affected us, all of us, so profoundly since that moment. You also have, you know, these incredible contributions by artists like Joan Cook-Ducey Smith. This is a piece called Trade, and I feel like this is also what Carl Beam was doing in that image, as he's saying, it's like doing a kind of offering, like he's wanting to close this chapter so that we can begin something else, I believe, as well as critique it. This is a painting from 1992, although Joan's been working for much longer than that, and it's called Trade. And up top, you can see a lot of stereotypical things, hats from Cleveland Indians, for example, and she's simply called it Gifts for Trading Land with White People. But I think it's a larger critique of consumption. A colleague of mine, Paul Chott-Smith, has said that Native people in the United States are simultaneously absent and present at the same time. And what he's talking about is there's this kind of consumption of Native identity, you could say, in even things like sports mascots or Land O'Lakes butter. And this consumption points to a kind of always there unconscious presence of Native folks, yet often a huge degree of historical amnesia in terms of, the histories of these lands, how we got to be here, their development before there was a kind of official authorship or even leading up to treaties, for example. And so for Joan, I think this replacement of land comes a very kind of flat or false representation of Native life through the circulation of stereotypes as a kind of trade. Of course, artists like Rebecca Belmore take on this absence differently. She's talking about the absence of bodies. This is a piece that's based on the story of one of the last Beothuk people who lived in what is now called Newfoundland in Canada. And there were stories of what became very public, actually, capturing and killing of, like, genocidal killing of these people, and also the taking of particularly women back to Europe as kind of examples of, or put on display. So she's talking about that story. She's talking about what is lost in that time. And you can see that here, the hands and feet, both the hands and feet are clenched. But what really draws your attention is the space in between. So thinking about, what that is. And I think by doing that, by calling attention to that absence, she's really highlighting, and I think making very acute what is lost. So for us, we wanted to focus a lot on artists who had been producing since the 2000s as well, to show what artists are interested in speaking about now. So some of the themes that artists are engaging with include displacement, forced migration, shadow histories, as well as means of reimagining the future. I think that there's the opportunity in many of the works to kind of upend dominant art history. But doing so, I think there's a deep interest in making space and in fostering other aesthetic practices, other histories, and other futures. One of the things that you can see as an overarching interest since the 1950s is self-determination, and that includes the inherent Indigenous rights to land, to language, to culture, and the increasingly urgent need for the process of decolonization to begin to reshape not only art histories, but museum ideologies and methodologies. I wanted to share with you these baskets by Shan Goshorn, the late Shan Goshorn, Cherokee artist, in part because I think they're a really good example of the decolonial process, or the process of decolonization. Shan learned old weaving practices through looking at museum collections and teaching herself those weavings based on looking at these cultural belongings. So that's one aspect that I think is really important, a kind of reclamation, historical reclamation of these weaving practices. The other is the way that she uses documents. So in some cases, maps, treaty documents, in some cases, boarding school ledgers. So in a way, all that's embedded and literally woven into the fabric of her sculptures are these histories. And in this case, we felt like it was really important to speak about what you see listed on this basket, and that is Cherokee country. This is a piece that we definitely saw quite a bit as part of Art for a New Understanding, and it's a piece by Dana Claxton, who's Lakota, called Headdress. She started a number of these after she did this first Lightbox image, and what she was doing was asking the sitter, and now she's collaborating with a number of friends of hers, to literally wear their cultural belongings. And what you see with that is a picture of relations. So even when I look at this image, you can see in the foreground, there's in fact a Maori piece that's in the center of, you can see that the beadwork that's actually lined with beaver for beaver shearling obviously comes from the north. That's probably Dene. You can see that this in fact forms a picture of not only close communal relations, but the vast trade networks that we've always had, and they're being upheld. So for me, it's really a picture of kinship. Others like Nicholas Gallinen, and this is actually a rug, and it's meant to, of course, look like TV static. It's called White Noise American Prayer Rug. What he wanted to speak to was what he was feeling was how this idea of white noise can be used as a mask to obliterate unwanted sounds or active disassociation that occurs when a signal is gone or lost. So he sees this as a representation of American political power right now, and to whiteness as a construct that can be used also to obliterate voices and rights of cultures, regardless of how complex this is and how complex the picture is of the United States. So he was talking about the increasing intolerance and also increasing, and this is very real, increasing hate that's being used to, in a way, obliterate and aid in the forgetting of the genocidal past of the United States as well as its present. So he's talking about the fact that he feels whiteness is more than a complexion, that it can be about inclusion and exclusion, and that it can also be a kind of distraction from our own suffering, he says, from love, from land, from water, from connection. He says in this space, there's no space for prayer, there's only noise. So clearly I think what he's getting to is not only reflecting back what he feels is a current reality, but talking about how do we get past this? How do we get past this so that we can form these connections again? How we can care for the land? How we can, all of us come together to do this. And I wanted to end, and I hope that there will be a chance to address some questions that can be put in the chat, but this is a work that was done initiated by Chanupa Hanska-Luger, who's actually from Standing Rock. It's called the Mirror Shield Project. He worked with many, many collaborators, including Rory Wakemup, who did the video that accompanied this work. The Mirror Shield Project took place at the No DPL Water Protector Camp. And you can see what they're holding. They're holding mirrors up. They're holding up a tool for reflection. So the idea behind these shields, especially when these hard lines are being drawn between water protectors, private security firms who had been brought in to protect corporate interests, the federal government, other levels of government as well, so police, state troopers, was that this was a form of protest, so that when these shields are brought, that those who are supposedly defending the interests of continued exploitation of native land would see themselves reflected back. This is an image of them in formation at the water protector camp. And interestingly enough, when I participated in the other week, there was a protest organized by a group here in Albuquerque called Red Nation. I also saw people carrying mirror shields. For me, what Standing Rock represented was an era of new Native rights, but again, one that was never disassociated from ideas of self-determination, sovereignty, and a deep care for the rights of water and the rights of land. So with that, I think I've given you quite a bit to think about, to consider, a kind of overview of the development of Native contemporary art, but also to say that one of the things that we talked about as the three of us as co-curators was, we see this only as a beginning. We see this as a beginning because there can only be one, we could only show one very small picture of this history. We knew that it would have many, many gaps. So many amazing artists were not represented necessarily in this exhibition as well. And we recognized that what we wanted to do was make this a beginning so that the understanding of American art history could be expanded, that we could move beyond inclusion, that we could move beyond having separate galleries or specific thematic exhibitions, that what we do is seen as it should be, and that is as foundational to the development of American art as we know it now. So thank you for listening to me. Thank you for taking the time. I know, we're all kind of listening from various places, from the comfort of our homes, for example. So yeah, I just want to thank you, and I want to thank my host tonight for inviting me to share this with you.
So Mindy, thank you. Patricia here back in Wichita. We're waiting for some of the viewers, people who are coming in to come forward with questions. Help us all to understand maybe just a little bit about the formation of the exhibition. You had 3 co-curators. How did you come together? Did you get an invitation from Crystal Bridges? Was it their conception, or did some of you reach out to them? How did that staging happen?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and I spoke to it a little bit. This was a project that was first initiated by Manuela Welloffman, who was at the time a curator at Crystal Bridges. She had started acquiring works by Native artists for the collection. She felt like it was foundational. She wanted to do this show, and she felt like she needed other collaborators to participate with her. And so we were in conversation for quite a while about me potentially joining that team. And then when Manuela went to the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts in Santa Fe, which is part of the Institute of American Indian Arts, we wanted to collaborate with Mindy Besaw. So it became a group of 3 of us, but we worked with many advisors to talk about, I think, what was needed in the field. One of them, Kathleen Ash-Milby, brought up the fact that she said, there have been many surveys of contemporary Native art. We had done a really big one, an international one at the National Gallery of Canada in 2013 called Sagahan, International Indigenous Art, that included 82 artists, for example. But the feeling was, and the consensus was, that even though a lot of these initiatives have happened, there was nothing that went farther back in time to kind of map this as a broader movement. So that was part of it. We engaged in a couple of years of research and dialogue. And I think importantly also, we knew that from the beginning, we didn't want this to be an exhibition that only took place at Crystal Bridges. It needed to travel. So it went to the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts, to the Nasher at Duke University, and finally to Memphis Brooks Museum. Because we felt like if it didn't travel, then maybe its influence would be a little bit stymied, or it was a little bit lessened. And in each case, those institutions also worked to do a lot of community consultation, including the development of land acknowledgement statements and relationships with local Indigenous communities if they didn't have them already. And it also resulted in the acquisition of a number of works by Native artists and the co-commissioning of works by Native artists too.
Can you tell us something about, you just mentioned that you had an advisory group or maybe multiple advisory groups, and yet you were already a community of 3 curators that shaped the show. At what points did the advisory groups come on board, and how did they guide some decision making for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. We knew that we needed to speak to many people. So we knew that we needed to speak to people who were already doing this good work. So we spoke to folks who were working at the National Museum of the American Indian, for example, but we also spoke to people who were working in some of the leading contemporary institutions now. So curators from the Hammer Museum, for example, in LA, Marshall Price, who is at the Nasher at Duke University. And so this needed to be a collaboration between all of us, because we realized that once again, there was a kind of siloing that was happening, and we didn't want that siloing to continue. And this was also part of the strategy for inviting particular writers for the catalog. So some have been working in this field for a very long time, like Heather Auton, who's an amazing Chickasaw curator and historian, but also people like Amelia Jones, who's a performance art historian who had actually written about Native art a bit, but never in depth. So we invited her to write a piece on Native performance art. And then we also invited Aruna D'Souza to speak about kind of the intersections or even the disconnect between the development of feminism and I would say the self-determination of Native women artists. And this was new scholarly work on behalf of all of them. But we saw this exhibition as an opportunity to kind of expand that discourse, but also expand the number of people who were spending, who were gaining knowledge in this, and I think doing really important research in it as well.
Yeah, I think you did that. Having organized lots of different exhibitions on my own over the years, of course, there's always reflection, the perspective at the end, only if I had, or the artists that we weren't able to include. At the end of the project, did you, were there thoughts like that, had we had that additional funding or additional room, or we had to leave a whole movement out because it just didn't fit?
Yes. There's so many. That's why I think we had to write that this is one history, and there's many voices that are left out. And that's also why we thought it was important when the exhibition traveled that local artists also be included in this. I think that, I could name a long list of people that we felt were important, but we couldn't include for various reasons. What we decided to do as a kind of framing mechanism was to really center it on figures who we feel had an influence not only themselves as singular artists, but on many others. So that's why, you know, in this room that begins with the 50s and then quickly progresses through the 60s and 70s and 80s, you see them. Some I didn't, you know, speak about in the slideshow, but they would include Kay Walkingstick as well as Jolene Rickard, who started her career as a photographer, and she was included in the really important exhibition at Artist Space, We're Always Turning Around on Purpose, and I believe that was in 1987. So in the inclusion of some artists, we also wanted to point to not only their work as an artist, but their work as making this community. And it was, in fact, Jolene who invited Lucy Lepard to see that show, and then Lucy ended up writing about it and, you know, becoming a real advocate for the broader understanding of Native art within what she was understanding then as a kind of multicultural movement. So we wanted to point to a number of these things, recognizing that the exhibition can only do so much, but hoping that, you know, maybe by some of these inclusions, people will do a deeper dive into that time and into those figures.
Mm-hmm. I think you've so wowed the viewing audience, the people who are zooming in, that we've only gotten compliments. We haven't gotten any questions for you, Candice. So maybe we'll leave it here. We just are just so painfully sorry that you didn't get to travel here and be with us in Wichita. And so you have our pledge that when this all blows over, we'll bring you here and have you speak again. Thank you for joining us tonight, though. Really,
Thank you.
Thank you.